Welcome back to the layout, where today we're going to look at my tube stock. I started building tube stock using this book, which has all the plans in it. And one day I'm going to build this district stock because it has the OPQ trailers in it, which I've already built. First up is this EFE Bakerloo stock, which is very pretty and very nice and commercially available and runs quite nicely, but is a very heavy train, and the bogies don't particularly make it easy to motorise. The power car, the leading one in this case, actually has two motors in it. Without it, they cannot pull the train. There's also a lead weight along the roof, but it's nice and it runs well. Next up is my surface OPQ stock. Had to be in red because that's how I remember it. Although I have distinct memories of a green set coming out from Richmond, but I was only about 3 or 4 at the time. I remember being fascinated by the little triangular ventilators. The trailer cars and the driving motors are actually the same body shell, except for the detail on the end of the driver's cab. The trailer cars were actually modelled before the mould was modified, and the windows scored in and the light clusters adjusted. Similarly, below the chassis, the trailer cars are a lot lighter than the motor cars, although there's still remarkably little underneath the underframes. The bogies are just re-wheeled backman items with slightly smaller wheels. I think they're actually Mark 1s. And although I'm not a fan of the backman coupling, when there is a complete set like these, they do actually keep the set very nicely close coupled. The distinctive vents modelled over the windows are actually moulded into the body shell, and you can see that I've also moulded the opening door buttons which featured on the early stock but disappeared by the time I remembered them in the early 70s. These body shells are incredibly light, and the chassis are plastic as well, so that one tenor shadow spud will actually pull a 6-car set. These are vacuum formed body shells. These are ones that I didn't get round to using. You can see the detail is actually scored onto the body shell by knife marks into the mould. I even created a seating mould because the insides, being surface stock, were large enough to make the seating a little more visible. The seating just fits inside the body shell and is painted and stuck to the chassis. Here are the wooden moulds for both the body and the seating. These are for vacuum forming, which is why there's tiny holes in the base, and all the sides are very, very slightly tapered. Although once again you'll notice that the body sides here are perfectly parallel and the centre section slides out, which is why the windows stick into the mould and are easily removed. The roof actually had a piece of paper on to disguise the lines that went down the centre of the mould. However, in the light you can still see the marks, even if only very slight, but the paper did give a line where I needed to paint the grey to, so it was a very helpful guide. Little nail heads were put in for the push buttons, and the windows, you can see more clearly, was scored onto the side of the beech moulding so that it showed up in the 1mm thick clear plastic covering that the vacuum forming became. These were a little more tricky to mould. I think they were matchsticks in the end, glued on, but they've got the little taper at the end, and although they're non-functional and don't open, they capture the spirit nicely. It was quite an art form to vacuum form these so that there was very little webbing down the corner, and in actual fact I had to put a wood block either side of this to stretch the plastic a little bit more, and that reduced the webbing. It got to the point where I could mould them in pairs quite easily, and so the 6 body shells that I produced were actually very easy to complete. You imagine trying to make this by hand. One carriage might have been a nightmare to do, but with all these ventilators, to get them all identical would have been an absolute nightmare. The transfers I found a long time ago, when I first had the idea of doing this in the late 1980s, and they've been stored ever since. I believe they're now commercially available again, but that's why some of the letters are slightly different colours when it comes to the letters for the actual running numbers. Overall, I think the set captures, certainly in my imagination, what the stock looked like in its heyday. Have you spotted what might be coming next? It's not this battery electric car model. This battery locomotive was bought through eBay, and from the pictures I thought it was a proper kit. It is a proper kit, I think. It's probably an Alpha Graphics kit mounted on Bachmann bogies again, but it's quite nicely made, and I didn't pay an awful lot for it, and although unmotorised, it captures the locomotive remarkably well. One day I want to make one of the CLR slab-sided with the funny brows at the front end, but that will have to wait. Surface stock was always easy to build from this plans book, and unfortunately the tube stock, although a lovely source, didn't have any plans in it. Fortunately, my resourceful uncle had these blueprints of the trailer car and the motor car for the Piccadilly stock, the standard Piccadilly stock. So these became my next models. So these are the standard stock from the late 20s, early 30s. And I've got 2 sets in the end, a plain red and the red and cream stock. Both motorised and both run nicely. These are once again extremely light vehicles and have a converted Lima, I think it's a con-flat bogie with the detail cut off it and the coupling altered to a NEM pocket with a close coupling on, and the other end, the motor end that has the raised section in, is actually a Bachmann bogie with the wheels changed to the right sort of size. There is some detail on the underside, fairly crude, but is laser cut out of acrylic, and the whole chassis are actually laser cut as well. Removing the lightweight body is relatively straightforward because the little lip at the bottom is kept on, particularly under the motor casing, which keeps the casing on top. The chassis itself doesn't feature any seats, it's just too small in my eyes to do so, but it does have the bulkheads, which again are laser cut from styrene and glued on. The motor cars are slightly different because they all have this raised chassis with this little 3mm spacer, but they're acrylic glued together along with the front end, which has got this little buffer section at the front. But as neither car is expected to connect in multiple, only in a 4-car set, it's only the outer ends that are so treated. I do find they can still run in multiple even if they're not actually physically connected together, which works quite well. Although these moulds might look similar, and the motor car particularly, the back end of it looks very similar to one of the trailer cars, I ended up making 2 moulds, one for the trailer and one for the motor, and I think these are both Metro Camel made. That allowed me to have 2 different roof styles from 2 different periods. So the motor has these roof little chutes built into the side, which are little brass inserts which work quite well, and of course it has this area, the cutout area, because it was the last of the above chassis equipment cars, the 38 tube stock, of course, had all the motor equipment below the chassis, allowing more passenger bays. So these grills on the side were the ventilators for the motor compartment, and these are actually brass rod dropped into a square hole carved into the side of the wood and super glued in place. Again, if you look at the ends, you can see that the sides come off separately, so the center part drops out and the sides are left in the mold. And you can see that again the detail for the motor driving end is embellished on the end. The doors are engraved or recessed slightly, and the ventilators are also recessed into the mold, which would mean that it wouldn't come out in normal circumstances. The screws on the bottom are to help pull the mold out, and the brass screws are the ones that hold the physical part of the body together. And you can see the lip here on the underside of the body shell, which is what actually holds the body onto the chassis. The trailer car, I think, is a 31 rather than a 27 design, and has a much smoother roofline. Still has the little recesses over the passenger compartments, but doesn't have the ventilators, and still has the inserted windows. And of course there's just a single door window at the end. But other than that, they're essentially the same, so I could at least mass produce the beach, that is the base part of the mould, as a couplet. But each mould took around 20 to 30 hours to carve and finish and to get right. But worth it in the end, because I've managed to produce an 8-car set quite easily. Try doing this as a one-off 8 times and making them all look the same. Impossible. With the red livery and the red and cream livery, and I actually ended up with more bogies than I needed, the temptation, along with the spare body shells, allowed me to then produce a BR Class 423. These, of course, were exported to the Isle of Wight and outlived their brethren by another few years, not finally withdrawn from the system around 1990, 1987, something like that. So whilst not motorised, this unit was painted up from a body shell, but is painted as S4, has got the British Rail no smoking symbols, and was the first application of the blue-grey in reverse livery, but is a rather nice little thing to have in the corner. I wondered how many of you spotted this in the background as the trains were going round. Needless to say, completely non-prototypical like this, but who cares, came about as a result of a trip to the Isle of Wight. I'd travelled on these in the mid-80s, and I went and travelled on the Bakerloo stock, so it was nice to see. So these are a poignant reminder of my youth when I actually travelled on them. I hope you've enjoyed my little trip through my underground tube stock. The surface stock and the tube stock are very unique and unusual and rare to see in model form, even though there are some commercially available ones these days. That completes my tube stock and London Underground transport stock list, except for the CLR locomotive that's on the workbench, so you might see another video about that in due course. If you've liked these, do try and subscribe, and please like, as it helps YouTube like me. See you next time.